On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, we look at early U.S. logistics in the Pacific from 1941 to 1942. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, at What's Going On with Shipping, we tend to look at what's happening currently with shipping, but you know me, as a historian, I like to go back and look at the past. Back in October, I was invited to give a talk for the Navy Marine Corps 250th anniversary up in Philadelphia. The talk I gave was actually across the river, the Delaware, on the Camden side, over on board the battleship New Jersey, hosted by a good friend of the show, Ryan Szymanski, and the crew on board there. I want to give you a longer version of that talk. That talk was about 15-20 minutes. This talk will be a little bit longer because this is a topic I am really excited about. I love talking about early U.S. World War II logistics, both naval and land. And we're going to look at that in the Pacific for the first year of the war. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So the video you're seeing here is a recording of USS Enterprise and USS Hornet on the way to Tokyo to launch Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his B-25 Raiders against Japan on April 18th of 1942. What you're seeing here is USS Sabine coming alongside Enterprise to conduct what's referred to as an underway replenishment. Underway replenishments, a refueling at sea, were key for allowing the U.S. to keep its carrier and strike forces at sea for prolonged periods of time. Without underway replenishment, the U.S. task force would really be restricted to about a 2,000-mile range based on the fuel oil carried on board their ships and depending on speed. Now you can see how dangerous this operation is. It involves very close steaming alongside. You have to haul over fuel oil hoses for both fuel oil and aviation fuel for the aircraft carriers. The crews on board the oilers are really exposed to the weather. This is the northern Pacific in April, so not a very nice environment to be in. Now, my paper talks about what I call the 4 R's: replenishment, repair, reinforcements, and replacements. All 4 of those are absolutely essential for establishing American military dominance in the Pacific in World War II. And I would argue that there is a similarity to what is happening today in 2025, going into 2026, with what was happening back in 1941, 1942. Here you're seeing replenishment. You're seeing the idea of doing underway replenishment, being able to sustain forces at sea. Repair, particularly forward repair, is going to be of particular interest. How do you keep naval forces in combat and, more importantly, prevent ships from being lost so that they can be later returned back into service? Reinforcements, how do you reinforce this area? How are you able to surge forces into it? And then replacements, how do you replace those combat forces that are lost? All of these are vital issues that come in for the execution of this operation. So this image is of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. You're looking across Ford Island at Battleship Row on the upper part there of Ford Island. And I highlighted a couple of key aspects because there are 3 elements that are in this image that are going to be important for U.S. Navy logistics going forward in the war. In red are the fuel farms. On Ford Island, you have this smaller red circle here that shows you the aviation fuel tanks here for Ford Island. But more importantly, up here is the upper fuel farm. These big tanks, of which 17 of them are visible here, each of these carry as much oil as a tanker, about 150,000 barrels of fuel each. In yellow, you see some of 2 of the 11 fleet oilers for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In the center here is USS Neosho, one of the fast oilers. And then over in the Navy Yard is USS Ramapo, which is one of the smaller oilers that are in the fleet. And then in green, you get some of the repair ships. So right alongside USS Arizona is USS Vestal. You'll see her right up alongside. There's a couple of other repair and tender ships scattered throughout Pearl Harbor. Then, of course, you have the Navy Yard itself. And the Navy Yard is going to be one of those major elements in the Pacific that's going to be a game changer for the U.S. Navy. Pearl Harbor and subsequently the other repair facilities on the west coast of the United States and even the east coast are all going to play a major role. This map and diagram shows you the location of all 13 oilers located out in the Pacific. 2 of them, Trinity and Pecos, are out in the Philippines. 1 of them, Pecos, will be lost early in the campaign. The remaining 11 are scattered across the Pacific. 2, as I noted before, are in Pearl Harbor, Ramapo, Neosho. 1 of them is en route to Hawaii, that is Neches. And then the rest of them are located either along the west coast with one other one, Bravos, up around Alaska. Now, the 11 oilers for the Pacific Fleet were absolutely essential to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet fueled. Did a full video on this with Woody over at World War II TV. I'll have the link above there so you can take a look at it. But the key thing is the 11 oilers were capable of carrying roughly around 750,000 barrels of fuel. There were 4.5 million barrels of fuel in the fuel farm at Pearl Harbor. However, Admiral Kimmel only had access to 500,000 barrels of fuel. The other 4 million were war reserves. He couldn't touch them. So he had to keep the Pacific Fleet sustained. Now, initially, the Pacific Fleet was using more than 500,000 barrels of fuel, but in 1941, a third of the Pacific Fleet was sent to the Atlantic, Battle Division 3, with the 3 New Mexico classes, plus the Yorktown, plus a cruiser division. That diminished the size of his fleet, but those 11 oilers were necessary to keep the fuel sustained in the Pacific. Now, you could still draw upon the war reserve when war comes, and a lot of discussion about whether or not the Japanese should have struck the oil reserves there at Pearl Harbor. I'm always of the opinion that if the Japanese even planned on striking those reserves, the third wave would have been a much smaller wave than the first 2. They would not have had the results they wanted by any estimation. The best case scenario would have been the Japanese destroying half of the oil located at Pearl Harbor. I don't think they come anywhere close to that, maybe a quarter of the oil. But even then, they would be able to sustain it. It may have hindered some early Pacific raids, but it would not have forced the withdrawal of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, for example, from Pearl Harbor back to the West Coast. Now, the key thing for the U.S. Navy early in the war, especially when it came to replenishment, was the fitting out of fast oilers. A dozen T3 tankers had been taken over by the U.S. Navy. 6 of them are earmarked for use in the Pacific: Cimarron, Neosho, Kaskaskia, Sabine, Guadalupe, and Plot. And the other 6 are out in the Atlantic, of which 4 of them are going to be taken in hand almost immediately and converted into the Sangamon class escort carriers, which are very important to understand. Those escort carriers of the Sangamon class are not escort carriers. They are interim light carriers for the U.S. Navy in 1942. They're going to assume the role of a fleet carrier. Basically, you take 3 of them, put them together, it equals a fleet carrier. We see that done with the 3 vessels off the coast of North Africa. The 4th one was used to ferry aircraft in. They sail alongside Ranger, and they act as a fleet carrier. We will also see it at the end of the Guadalcanal Campaign in early 43, when 2 and later 3 of those carriers come in to support Saratoga while Enterprise is up in the shipyard in Pearl Harbor. But the Cimarron class fast oilers are absolutely essential. Number one, they are much larger than the conventional oilers the U.S. Navy has. At almost 150,000 barrels, they're anywhere from twice to 3 times the size of the late World War I era oilers. And most importantly, they're fast, 18 knots, much faster than the 10 to 14 knots we see in the earlier classes. So it's impossible to look at the entire Pacific War here. So instead, what I'm going to do is focus on a couple of key events that take place and different styles. So we're going to look at 2 raids, and particularly the very first attempt to raid Wake Island by USS Lexington, and then we're going to look at the Ley Salamanca raid in March of 1942. We're going to look at the Battle of Midway, but in a way you may have never looked at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, and then we're going to look at the invasion and campaign for the Battle of Guadalcanal. Now, this map here is a composite drawn from the West Point Atlas. It takes together 2 maps maps and kind of configures them together. And I want to highlight just a couple of key points here. Number one, the Japanese fast carriers, the Kitubutai. These are the 6 big fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, are used on the attack on Pearl Harbor. But one of the things that you'll see is almost immediately those carriers will begin to sail westward. And their sailing westward is very important because it's going toward their ultimate goal, which is the possession of Southeast Asia, the oil and resource-rich area of the British and Dutch East Indies. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, in many ways, is meant to send the U.S. fleet off balance. They then sail westward, carry Division 2, which is the Hiryu and Soryu, assist in the suppression of Wake Island. But then the fleet is going to be used, and it's usually between 4 carriers, with some of the carriers rotating off, are going to be used for a variety of different missions. In January, they're going to attack Rabaul. In February, they're going to be used down here at Darwin. In March, they're going to be used in the Dutch East Indies. And in April, the raid out into the Indian Ocean, Operation C, to attack the British East India Fleet and seize the Andaman Islands. And one of the things that the Kitubutai, the first air fleet, does is it's aimed to suppress U.S. and British forces. By the time it's done, by the time you get to this operation in April of 1942, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is at Pearl Harbor. The British Eastern Fleet has been run out of Ceylon, out of Adu Atoll, and is actually based on the east coast of Africa at Mombasa. That puts the 2 U.S. and the British fleet 10,000 miles apart. There are 10,000 miles between those 2 forces. And what is left is the Americans have to prioritize their defense because the Japanese attack has basically severed the ability of Australia to be connected back to the British Empire across the Indian Ocean. Now, there is still movement across the Indian Ocean, but it's going to require an effort by the British Eastern Fleet, along with American and Australian forces, to convoy across that region so that, for example, when the Australians will send back their divisions from the Middle East, the 6th and 7th Australian, when fuel oil will come out of the Persian Gulf, it's going to require escorts from either the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, or the U.S. Navy. USS Phoenix, a light cruiser, for example, is going to be based on the west coast of Australia for this period of time. In the meantime, the United States draws up really 2 priorities, and these 2 priorities are going to be absolutely essential. One is the defense of the area in and around Hawaii, the Hawaii, Midway, Johnston Island triangle. So guarding this area in the Central Pacific is essential. Hawaii is the main base. It has to be defended because it is the only place you can sustain the Pacific Fleet out. Midway and Johnston Island are really outward outposts for that area. And then it's the supply line between Australia and the United States. This has got to be protected because the fear is that Australia could be cut off. Australia may pull out of the war. There was a lot of concerns about this. Nobody knew for sure exactly what was going to happen. And when you look at Japanese plans, after the attack into the Indian Ocean, Japan wanted to reset and then turn from westward to eastward. And so they had a series of plans lined up. First plan was their attack against Port Moresby in southern New Guinea, along with the attack on Tulagi at the very end of the Solomon Islands. That puts them athwart that main supply line heading into eastern Australia. That was planned for May of 1942. In June of 1942, we know that the Japanese are launching their attack into the Central and North Pacific. This is their attack on Midway and the subsequent landings on Attu, Adak, and Kiska that are going to be launched. And the goal here is to shut the North Pacific, that access route, so that the Americans can strike across the Northern Pacific to hit Japan. Remember, Japan used that same route to hit Pearl Harbor. They are aware of the vulnerability they have. By seizing these bases, they hope to close off that sea space, also to put the American base at Pearl Harbor within reach of their own. And then in July of 42, they want to strike into that supply chain route between Australia and the United States by hitting Noumea in New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Now, that does not sever the supply line between Australia and the United States. What it does is it pushes it further south, so that Bora Bora here in the Tahiti and the Society Islands will become a major port here, and then the route will have to actually go further south down into New Zealand and then eventually over to Australia. It just makes it more difficult for the United States to be able to sustain the Australians and keep the Australians in the fight. This issue about defending Australia and that supply line is absolutely key. The Australians get into a nasty fight with the British over the return of their second Australian Imperial Force. This is the force that's sent over into North Africa, the 6th, 7th, and 9th Australian Infantry Divisions. They've sent the 8th up into Singapore, where it's going to be lost. And at the same time, the United States has to look at that supply line and sit there and say, we have to commit forces here. That's at the same time it's dealing with a pull of forces over into Europe. All right. The very first raid launched by the United States was actually going to be 3 raids. A raid against the Gilbert and the Marshall Islands by the Enterprise and the Yorktown carrier strike forces, but at the same time, USS Lexington was going to undertake a raid against Wake Island. Now, Wake Island had fallen in December of 1941. A lot of ink has been spent about whether or not Wake Island could have been saved. I will tell you that in reading the upper-level communiques from the United States, it was not justified to risk the forces to save Wake Island when the priority was to defend the Midway, Johnston Island, Hawaii triangle. And so Wake, unfortunately, was expendable. But one of the things these 3 early raids, the Wake, Gilbert, Marshall Islands raid, wants to do is sit there and say, listen, we want to get the Japanese intentions. If you look at the Japanese strike forces, all of them are moving eastward except for one, number 5 right here. And this is a sortie by Rear Admiral Yamaguchi in February of 1941 with 4 of the carriers countering this raid against the Japanese. One of the things the Americans are hoping to do is distract the Japanese, get them off their game, have them withdraw forces away from Southeast Asia. And at the same time, the U.S. wants to slow down the Japanese invasion of these islands to their east. They want to slow down the invasion of Port Moresby and Tulagi. They want to slow down potential landings in islands that are athwart those supply chains. And so when the Americans launch these carrier raids, it's not just against the bases, it's against the logistics hubs that are there. Now, the raid on Wake Island does not happen, at least not the first one done by Lexington. Realizes a vulnerability that they really hadn't appreciated. To get out to Wake Island would require a carrier strike group to have an oiler. And in the case of the USS Enterprise returning back to Pearl Harbor on the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had just delivered VMF 211 to Wake Island, 12 Marine Corps Wildcats, F4, F3s. That operation had basically exhausted the Enterprise and its task force's fuel. Enterprise reported when it arrived back into Pearl Harbor on December 8th, it was at 50% fuel. The heavy cruisers, 3 of them, were down to 30% fuel, and the 6 destroyers were down to 20% fuel. So what that meant was if you're going to raid Wake Island and have the potential to run in at high speed and out at high speed, you needed an oiler. So when Lexington sails for Wake, she is going to be accompanied by this oiler, USS Netchez. This is one of the older oilers. Not as capable as the fast oilers of the Neosho class, but Netchez had proven to be really a solid oiler. She'd done a lot of work. She was probably one of the best experienced oilers there were. Unfortunately, Netchez never joins up with the Lexington Task Force. She is sunk by a Japanese submarine just west of Pearl Harbor. And what that tells the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, is he cannot send out logistics forces without convoys, without escort. And the Pacific Fleet is going to have to bleed off forces to protect its logistics. I know we hear all the time how unsuccessful Japanese submarines were in World War II, But in 1941 and 1942, they are successful in that they're diverting forces and requiring the U.S. to establish convoys. Task Force 15, which is a supply chain task force that's set up between the west coast of the United States and forward Pacific bases, is created. And most importantly, every oiler that will sail from now on will have the escort of at least a destroyer with them. Now, the other raid I want to talk about is the raid on Lae. This is a raid by the USS Yorktown and Lexington on the forces gathered off of Lae in northern New Guinea. Now, the task force that goes down there, Lexington and Yorktown, is a really interesting one. Yorktown is led by Jack Fletcher. The Lexington task force is led by Vice Admiral Brown. Wilson Brown is the senior commander here, but Brown is going to be relieved right after this operation. He's going to be sent back and take over command of amphibious training forces for the Pacific Fleet. But the raid into Lae and the northern coast of New Guinea demonstrates really the significance of having a well-coordinated logistics force in place. This chart shows you the fuel consumption for Task Force 11 in March of 1942. And this covers every day from March 1st all the way to March 25th. There is a duplicate day there because they go across the date line. The 18th happens twice. But what you see here is the amount of fuel by percentage that the carriers, the cruisers, and the destroyers have. So if you look here on March 1st, for example, the Lexington is sitting at about 70% fuel, the cruisers are at 60%, and the destroyers are just over 72%. One of the techniques the U.S. had developed during the interwar years was not just the ability to refuel from oilers, but to use their major surface combatants, carriers, battleships, and cruisers, to refuel destroyers. Because destroyers are the fuel hogs. They're the ones that will consume fuel faster than anybody else. So what you see here is going into the raid on Lae, the task force will refuel over 3 days from Kaskaskia, one of those fast oilers. They get themselves up to their almost 90% fuel, and then they do their fast run-in into Lae and then their fast extrication out of the area. So much so that the destroyers, for example, which are nearly topped up to 100% on March 7th, by the time they come out, are down below 50%. Now, they're going to be refueled from the cruisers and carriers, but in the meantime, the carriers and the cruisers are losing fuel, so much so that by the time you get to March 15th, the cruisers and carrier are just over 30%, a really low shortfall there of fuel. They meet Neosho on 15-16, refuel back up, and do it again on the 22nd. And one of the things I think it's really important to note here is that Admiral Fletcher, who gets a lot of criticism for refueling, and we're going to see this play out in the Midway and Guadalcanal campaigns, really understands fueling better than probably any commander out there because he experiences it time and time again. And we're going to come back to that. So the raids kind of set the establishment for underway replenishment. The other thing they demonstrate too is that you're going to attrit part of your air groups. And what happens is after the strikes, they lose part of their air groups. They're going to come back into Pearl Harbor and other bases and replenish their air groups. The exception to that is Lexington and Yorktown down in the Southern Pacific. When Lexington leaves the area, it leaves Yorktown behind. Before Lexington departs, it flies off part of its air group to replenish the Yorktown air group. So Lexington will sail short of aircraft back to Pearl Harbor because it's going to replenish back there. John Lundstrom, in his great books on naval aviation early in the Pacific War, talk about this. But most of the other raids are the carriers will launch their strikes. They're going to attrit part of their air groups. They're going to come back to Pearl Harbor. They're going to replenish their air groups and then head back out. The next element I want to talk about here is the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway we're going to discuss in a way that you probably have never heard about before. If you have, probably not in a lot of great detail. So I'm going to talk about 4 ships and their role in doing the replenishment, repair, reinforcements, and replacements. 3 of them are featured here in this video. So first part here, replenishment. So down below you see the USS Caiden. Now that is not Caiden in its naval guise. It's actually post-World War II when it was outfitted for commercial service. She is an AOG. That means a small gasoline tanker. Kailua is going to be important because Kailua is going to come into Midway to replenish the Midway fuel stores. And we're going to talk about why that is so crucial here in a few moments. When it comes to repair, everybody knows the story about USS Yorktown being damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea and coming up and sitting in dry dock number 1 before heading out for the Battle of Midway. What many people don't know is USS Vero, that was a minesweeper, was redesignated just short of the battle into a tug, AT-144. And Vero is going to be out there to help in the salvage and repair of any damaged vessels. It's going to play a very important role, matter of fact, in the attempted repair for USS Yorktown. And then when we talk about reinforcements, there are two really vessels that play a big role in reinforcements. One of them is a cruiser, the USS Nashville. Nashville is going to sail into Midway just before it heads up to Alaska as part of Task Force 8, and it's going to drop off 2 companies of Marine raiders. Those raiders are going to reinforce the islands to provide a striking force on both Eastern and Sand Island, the 2 islands that make up Midway Atoll, so that if the Japanese are able to land on the island, they will be able to resist that. But probably the ship that's probably the most significant is USS Kitty Hawk, a ship we're going to talk about later here. Kitty Hawk is a modified sea train cargo vessel. It was designed to carry fully loaded trains. Kitty Hawk arrives at Midway and offloads aircraft reinforcements, specifically F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, to reinforce the air group that is located at Midway. The other reinforcement will come from the U.S. Army Air Forces. B-26s are going to be set up, but most significantly B-17 Flying Fortresses. Again, we're going to come back to that. The other vessel we're going to talk about is subsequently coming up here, and that's going to be USS Saratoga, a carrier not usually identified with the Battle of Midway. So, Battle of Midway, I'm not going to go through the full Battle of Midway because there are plenty of books on that. I cannot do any justice to the Battle of Midway that John Parshall and Tony Tully did in Shattered Sword, or any of the latest iterations that have come out since then. However, I will note that I'm going to cover an aspect of the battle that almost never gets discussed. And again, it goes back to our 4 R's. Depicted there is Yorktown under attack, and then on the right there is Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Spruance, the commanders of the 2 task forces. Admiral Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 with the Yorktown. Admiral Spruance commanded Task Force 16, which was the Enterprise and Hornet. A lot of questions about Spruance taking command. I got to say, Fletcher was a cruiser division commander. Matter of fact, Spruance relieved him as cruiser division commander. So not really a big surprise that Spruance takes over in this battle. So a couple of things to note. So on May 28th, Task Force 16 departs Pearl Harbor. This is the Enterprise and Hornet. On May 30th, Task Force 17, this is Yorktown, will depart Pearl Harbor. On May 31st, the Enterprise refueled from 2 oilers that are off the coast of Midway. Now, there are going to be 3 fast oilers in and around the region of Midway. There's going to be a 4th at Pearl Harbor. The 5th is up in Alaska. The 6th one, the Neosho, had been sunk. So on May 31st, Task Force 16 will refuel. Notice the date, May 31st. Over June 1st and 2nd, Yorktown will refuel. Fletcher does not refuel until the last moment. He knows that he can expect to see the Japanese arrive either on June 3rd or June 4th. He waits until the last moment to refuel. I again think this is Fletcher learning from his issues with refueling over the course of many months. He, during the Battle of Coral Sea, will be very hard on Admiral Fitch, who commands the Lexington Task Force. Fitch had relieved Brown on the Lexington. Fitch actually takes too long to refuel, doesn't refuel soon enough, and more importantly, during the Battle of Coral Sea, Fletcher will lose his fast oiler, the Neosho, really crippling his force. So you have the Battle of Midway on June 4th and 6th. We're going to skip over that because that's not the point we're looking at here. On June 6th, Task Force 16, commander of Desron 1, reports fuel on board his destroyers for 12 hours at 25 knots and 40 hours at 15 knots. One of the orders sent to Spruance was to cut his destroyers loose and execute a torpedo attack against the fleeing elements of the Japanese fleet, but he refueled May 31st. It is now 7 days later, and his carriers have been running around at 25 knots, and while the carriers and cruisers had fuel, the destroyers did not. So much so that he realizes he can't order his destroyers out. He's at a critical fuel shortage. Matter of fact, that is the bulk of his destroyers. There's actually a destroyer that's in a worse position than this. But at the same time, Task Force 17 will refuel from Plott. Now, at this point, Yorktown has been damaged. It is under salvage at this moment. Fletcher is concerned that he has to keep his task force fueled in case there is a subsequent engagement. Remember, not everybody knows the battle is over at this point. On June 7th, Guadalupe, this is the third oiler that is sent up to the region around Midway, is going to transfer fuel to Keole. This is because Midway is critically short on fuel. Midway is operating an entire carrier air group basically out of Midway. And Midway is consuming fuel at an alarming rate. And one of the reasons it's consuming fuel at an alarming rate is half of its fuel supply, 375,000 gallons in 16 out of the 31 tanks, was destroyed on 22 May because of an inadvertent detonation of explosives. They were hooking up explosives to the tanks so that if the Japanese invaded, they could destroy them. Well, while hooking them up, they inadvertently exploded half the tanks. So they had rushed fuel to Midway to replace portions of that, but not all of it. But because of the number of airstrikes being launched, particularly with the B-17s and the PBYs that are in the area, they've got to get fuel up there. So Guadalupe, they don't want to bring Guadalupe into Midway because it's too high value. So they transfer fuel over to Keole, and Keole is going to run into Midway to replenish Midway. On June 8th and 9th, finally, Spruance is going to refuel from Cimarron and Guadalupe. Plott and Cimarron had basically dumped more than half their fuel. Plott consolidated its fuel into Cimarron, and Plott ran back to Pearl Harbor. So finally, Task Force 16 will refuel. Notice it had not refueled since May 31st. It had been out for almost 10 days before refueling. On June 10th, Task Force 16 was going to rendezvous with Saratoga and Kaskaskia. Now, Task Force 16 at this point does not have Yorktown. Yorktown was sunk on June 7th by an attack from I-168 that sinks both Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond. But in the meantime, Fletcher on board Astoria raced out to meet Saratoga coming from the west coast. He was going to take command. Remember, Fletcher is in overall command of the strike group. And one of the things that he was doing was heading east to go meet Saratoga, get on board Saratoga, bring Saratoga up. And what he wants to do is replenish Enterprise and Yorktown, as we're going to talk about here. And then on June 11th, Saratoga is going to transfer aircraft from Enterprise to Hornet. This image here, which is a drawing actually, shows that moment when Yorktown and Hammond are hit by I-168. It's actually after the torpedo strike. This is Hammond blowing up when she sinks and her depth charge is going off. You'll see off the bow of Yorktown here, Vero has cut her tow line. She's actually circling back here, heading over to Yorktown. One of the big lessons comes out of the Battle of Midway was how crucial it was to have salvage efforts and salvage equipment close by. Vero was there to provide the tow. It freed up the cruisers. Initially, they were using a heavy cruiser to do it, but they'd much rather use a fleet tug with its horsepower and, more importantly, its expendability than to tie up a heavy cruiser. The Saratoga, in the meantime, Task Force 11 arrives into the area. Now, Saratoga had rushed from the west coast. It had undergone an extensive repair. It had been torpedoed in January of 1942. It also lost its 8-inch deck guns, replaced by 5-inch 38s, kind of really the template that you'll see on the Essex-class carriers later. But the other thing on Saratoga was her flight deck was beefed up, particularly her arresting gear. If you look at her air group she comes out with, she has 107 planes in one of the most strangest air groups ever created. It is a composite air group made up of 3 fighter squadrons, 2 scouting squadrons, 2 torpedo squadrons, along with some SBDs being ferried out. If you look at her torpedo planes, they're a mix of Devastators and Avengers. She will rendezvous with Task Force 16 and transfer over parts of her air group. So to Hornet goes 9 Dauntlesses and 10 TBF Avengers. Hornet, since it was the newest aircraft carrier in the fleet, had already been upgraded. It had the new arresting gear so it could handle the Avengers. Enterprise gets 10 Dauntlesses. It gets the 5 Devastators because they cannot handle Avengers yet. During the period after Pearl Harbor up to the Battle of Guadalcanal, Enterprise is going to be taken in hand, and she is going to be updated. Then Saratoga heads back to Pearl Harbor and picks up her air group. She was actually coming out ferrying aircraft. So the group on board Saratoga was not designed to go into battle. Instead, what she was doing was ferrying. The Saratoga air group had been left in Pearl Harbor. Matter of fact, part of it was on board Yorktown. She reloads her air group, plus takes on board 2 squadrons to ferry out to Midway. The Midway Air Group, especially the single-engine planes of the Marine Air Group, had been decimated. So she brings out a scouting bombing squadron, VMSB 231, and a fighter squadron, an Army fighter squadron, the 73rd Fighter Squadron, made up of 25 P-40s. Now, there was a plan to bring Army fighters out to Midway before that, but the reason it wasn't done was because once you fly off those P-40s on the Midway, they're stuck. You can't get them off. They can't fly back. Now, subsequently, the U.S. is going to develop a series of landing strips between Midway and Hawaii so that you can ferry the aircraft. But right now, because there's not a Marine air group or a Marine fighter group that can go out to Midway, they decide to send the P-40s out there. So when we talk about the 4Rs, Midway has got all of them. We got replenishment, and we've got issues with replenishment during the battles. Spruance is actually the one who seems to have the biggest issue regarding that. Repair, we've got Vero out there. We had Yorktown going into dry dock number 1 for repairs, so that repair plays an absolutely essential role. We got reinforcements. We had the reinforcement with aircraft out to Midway with the Marine Raider Group to make Midway as kind of impenetrable as possible, or at least as fortified as possible, should the Japanese land. A lot of discussion about even if the Japanese had landed on Midway, would they have been able to take it? I don't think so. I don't think the Army group they had on there was going to take Midway. And then finally, the replacements. The role of Saratoga, I think, is really important because one of the things it does is it rebuilds the air groups on Enterprise and Hornet so that Enterprise and Hornet can head north to help counter the invasion of the Aleutians. Now, that has turned around very quickly. Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance are ordered back to Pearl Harbor because what's happening here now is that the decision is going to be made that, listen, we can afford to lose the Aleutian Islands, the very western part of the Aleutians, but what we need to do is consolidate our striking groups back and plan for an offensive that's going to happen down at Guadalcanal. And that's going to require another element here, and that's going to be troop ships. And troop ships play a very important role early in the Pacific and the Atlantic War. So this chart right here shows you all the troop ships, the APs, that the U.S. has largely before 1943. And so they run all the way from USS Henderson, AP-1, which was a troop ship that had been existed all the way back to World War I, all the way down there to USS Thurston, AP-77. Now, there are a couple of missing ships in here. Not all ships come over and are taking over. Some are not commissioned. But this shows you all the ships that are there. Now, I want to highlight some particular ships here. So USS Wakefield, AP-21, through USS Hunter Liggett, AP-27. Those ships are particularly of notice because they were transporting at the beginning of the war in the Pacific the British 18th Division from Great Britain over to Singapore. So the U.S. was using its troop ships to help redeploy a British infantry division. It was initially going to the Middle East, but it was diverted to Singapore. These represent some of the best troop ships in the U.S. Military: Wakefield, Mount Vernon, West Point. And so the U.S. is going to be using these troop ships to basically readjust and deploy forces overseas. Notice they're all designated as AP, but some of them later on are going to be designated APAs. And APAs are attack transports. So you see an image of an AP above. This is a troop ship. Basically, it's a modified passenger liner turned over into a troop ship. An APA, an attack transport, what makes it an attack transport is it has on board the landing craft to be able to take the troops off the ship and put them over the beach. A troop ship does not. Troop ships typically either have to go pierside or they rely on landing craft from other vessels. And what you see here is the allocation of troop ships for the two big amphibious invasions the U.S. will execute in 1942. In yellow, Guadalcanal, and in green, Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Notice the U.S. does not have a lot to spare here. Troop ships that are not committed to this endeavor are executing subsequently follow-up missions. They also will take a heavy toll. You'll see a loss of troop ships. You lose the George Eliot, for example, off Guadalcanal. German U-boats get in among the landing craft off North Africa, and you lose a series of ships off there. And then you have the most famous, the February 1942 fire on board USS Lafayette, better known as SS Normandy. But you'll see that these troop ships are really important in terms of the reinforcement. So the next series of charts come from the U.S. Army's Green Books. This is a series of books written by the U.S. Army post-World War II that's kind of the official history of the U.S. Army in World War II. The U.S. Army has it. The Army Air Forces have it. The Marine Corps has it. You know who doesn't have it? The U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy does not have an official history. Yes, Samuel Eliot Morison wrote 15 volumes, but they're not the official histories. However, the U.S. Army, along with the Marine Corps, are going to have to, in the period of 1941 to the beginning of 1943, deploy forces between the Pacific and the Atlantic. It's one of the big fights among the two armies, Europe first or Pacific first. And what's really interesting is when you look and see where units are deployed, you begin to understand U.S. military strategy in a much different way. So in December of 1941, there are 3 U.S. divisions that are deployed overseas. There's the Philippine Division over in the Philippines, along with the Philippine Army, which is there. The Philippine Army was just coming up into full fruition. The plan was, hopefully by April of 1942, have a Philippine Army of about 10 divisions stationed there and make the Philippines largely self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and be able to hold out against any Japanese attack. It's not there yet. And then you had what was the Hawaiian Division in Hawaii that was split into 2 understrength divisions, the 24th and 25th Infantry Division. So in January of 1942, as U.S. enters the war, there's an immediate need to dispatch forces to shore up our allies. In the case of England, the 34th Infantry Division, National Guard unit, is going to be sent out to Northern Ireland. One of the reasons for the dispatch of the 34th is to free up British units so that they can go and reinforce the Far East, but also reinforce the Middle East. The British have got to get forces out there to shore up what's happening against the Japanese and also what's happening in North Africa against Rommel and the Afrika Korps. At the same time, the U.S. has got to do something about that long extended supply line to Australia, so it sends out a Marine Brigade, the first of 2 Marine brigades that are going to be sent out to Samoa to guard Samoa. Initially, the 8th Marines go out there, 8th Marine Regiment. Later on, the 7th Marine Regiment is going to go out there. And they're going to be planted right there in Samoa, about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. In March of 1942, you see more reinforcements being sent out, and in this time, they're not going to the Atlantic, they're both going to the Pacific. 27th Infantry Division, again, another National Guard division, goes out to Hawaii. In the meantime, the 24th and 25th Infantry divisions are plussed up to full division, so now you have 3 divisions sitting in Hawaii. And then a task force is going to be sent out, what eventually will become the Marical Division or the 23rd Infantry Division. That's later on after World War II. But the American Caledonian Division, this is going to go guard Noumea. Again, about halfway between Samoa and Australia. It is seen as a vital point to go grab. The Free French hold the island. The United States wants to send a force there to ensure that Noumea is there so that the supply line can be maintained between the U.S. and Australia. Plus, it's a key area for flying air forces through the region. April of 1942, we see the deployment of the 41st Infantry Division over to Australia. This is the first of 2 National Guard divisions that are going to go into Australia. This is to offset the 6th and 7th Australian divisions that are going to take time to come back from the Middle East. This is part of our guarantee to Australia that we will help defend them. Remember, April of 42, we've just seen the fall of the Philippines, the fall of the Dutch East Indies, the fall of Singapore from February until April of 42. So Australia is really feeling besieged at this moment. Plus, supply line between Western Australia over to the Middle East is very precarious after the Japanese raid into the region. May 42, you start seeing more reinforcements. The 32nd Infantry Division will head out to Australia. The 5th Infantry Division goes into Iceland. That's going to relieve the 6 Marines that are out there. And then the 1st Armored Division also into Northern Ireland there to buttress up forces. So again, this comes right on the heels of what's going to be a big British defeat out in North Africa with the fall of Tobruk and the British retreating back to the El Alamein line. June 42, the 37th Infantry is going to go out to Fiji. This is going to free up New Zealand forces. One of the things we're trying to do is get to New Zealand. New Zealand has their 2nd Division over in the Middle East. The 2nd Division is going to stay over there, eventually fight in Italy. But New Zealand is trying to put together a 3rd Division. Division had fought in World War I. The 2nd Division was in World War II. Now this 3rd Division, which is going to be basically 2 New Zealand brigades, is going to be freed up. So the 37th goes into Fiji. August of 1942, we see the Big Red 1 head over to England. The first U.S. troops arrive in England. Very appropriate. It's the 1st Infantry Division. But we also see the 1st Marines. We're going to talk more about the 1st Marines when we talk about the Guadalcanal Campaign, are going to be cobbled together from regiments down in New Zealand and also some coming from the west coast of the U.S. and execute the first amphibious raid. This is the attack on Guadalcanal. So those list of yellow highlighted ships, those are the ones that are going to transport in the 1st Marine Division along with its attached units. In September, the 40th Infantry Division is going to head over to Hawaii, again building up Hawaii into a much stronger, impregnable fortress, a base from which Central Pacific forces will later be able to execute the Central Pacific Drive. In the meantime, Australian and American forces now are heading over into New Guinea. The 32nd Infantry Division will deploy up into New Guinea, Port Moresby, and then subsequently over into Buna. Then in October, the 43rd Infantry Division is going to head over to New Zealand, again freeing up New Zealand forces. And then the 29th Division, the blue and the gray from Virginia and Maryland, are going to head over to England. And so by October of 1942, you've got this buildup of forces in the British Isles. You have a buildup of American forces in the Central Pacific and Hawaii. You got American forces strung out on that supply line from Australia to Hawaii in the Western Pacific. And then you have American forces engaged in Guadalcanal with the 1st Marines and the 32nd Infantry in New Guinea. November, you get Operation Torch. So you see the 3rd Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division head out and hit North Africa. At the same time, the 2nd Marines come together at Guadalcanal. This reinforcements are going to be sent over there, along with units from the Americal Division are going to be sent into Guadalcanal. And so that by the end of 1942, we're seeing a big redeployment here, with the 41st, 32nd into New Guinea, the 25th Infantry, the Americal, 1st and 2nd Marines on Guadalcanal. You add the 1st and 2nd Armored Division along with the 34th Infantry into North Africa. And then the last division that moves out in January 43, then you have a bit of a lull here until more units move out, will be the 9th Infantry Division coming into North Africa. And the 1st Marines are pulled out and head to Australia. Initially, the 25th Infantry is supposed to go down to General MacArthur, but they divert the 25th Infantry into Guadalcanal, and instead he gets the 1st Marines, and you'll see the 1st Marines coming in later into Cape Gloucester. So that was meant to show you how the reinforcements move on with just Army and Marine Corps units. And again, it paints a very interesting picture. We tend to talk about Europe first and this massive amount of troops going in. But when you look at this chart, look how many divisions are in Europe versus how many are in the Central and South Pacific. You've got the 2 Marine divisions down in Guadalcanal. You've got 9 Army divisions across the Pacific. Meanwhile, you have 8 Army divisions in Europe. So again, the idea of Europe first isn't quite right. It's one of the reasons that Eisenhower, when he was at the war plans, was talking about not diverting forces over to MacArthur, that they really needed to shore up the supply lines. And it really becomes really crucial. You're putting units like the 37th Infantry, the Americal, the 6th and 7th Marine Regiments onto those supply lines to ensure it. Then you're building up Australia. So that takes us to the final piece here, which is the invasion of Guadalcanal. Now we're going to run through the whole Guadalcanal campaign. Instead, I'm going to focus on August of 42, the invasion portion. So we've already talked about the deployment of land forces, but the other element here is the deployment of the Army Air Force and Marine Air Forces across the area. On Palmyra, Christmas Island, Canton, Fiji, and down in New Caledonia, you have fighter squadrons from the Army Air Forces. Then you have Marine elements here on also Afati, over in Tonga, and over in Samoa. And then anchoring at both ends of this are B-17s, B-17 flying fortresses. Now, the B-17 gets a bad rap in the Pacific in World War II for a variety of reasons, but in early 1942, the B-17 was the wonder weapon. It was the weapon that the Army Air Forces believed could really neutralize Japanese naval forces. It must be remembered that the Flying Fortress name doesn't come from all the machine guns it carried. I know that's the common image, but Martin Caiden's book, Flying Forts, talks about the idea that the reason the Flying Forts got their name was they were flying out from Fortress America out to really interdict naval vessels coming in. That was the initial mission for the B-17s. And because of the B-17's long range, over 700 miles, it was seen that B-17s could reach out, and they had been used at Midway. And yes, the B-17s had many false claims at the Battle of Midway. They did not strike the Japanese aircraft carriers. However, one of the key things the B-17s did is they did attack the transport fleet. And more importantly, after locations were found of Japanese naval units, it was B-17s that took over the monitoring of those ships. Because of the armament of the B-17s, more so than PBY Catalinas, the B-17s could maintain the presence. And after the attack on Midway, the U.S. Army, along with Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet, put together this idea for mobile B-17 strike forces, one in Hawaii and one down in Australia. And the idea being you can move them along those lines and you could rapidly move B-17s into any of these airfields between Hawaii and Australia and be able to strike at potential invasion forces and support subsequent attacks. And so the B-17s play a big role here in the development of this air ferry route between Hawaii and Australia. Now, Guadalcanal is always identified as the first offensive objective of the United States in the Pacific War. However, I think you really need to put it into context. It's not just Guadalcanal, it's also Port Moresby and Buna. And those twin offensives, in many ways, are going to be microcosms for what becomes later the big twin drives. It's going to be the Pacific forces led by the Navy, in this case under Vice Admiral Gormley, who we're going to talk about in a minute, and Admiral Nimitz versus General MacArthur and the Southwest Pacific forces. In this case, they're both aiming toward Rabaul. Later on, it's going to be aiming toward Japan. And this is how that offensive gears up. Now, the initial part of the Guadalcanal offensive comes under a lot of attack for a variety of reasons. One of the big assertions is the U.S. Navy will abandon the Marines at Guadalcanal in the initial part following the invasion. Now, I will say that the U.S. Navy suffers losses much heavier than the Marine Corps during the Guadalcanal campaign, and I disagree with this vehemently, that the U.S. Navy does not abandon the Marine Corps. What I think doesn't happen, and probably should, is a critical look at the command structure that is in place. Most of the command structure criticism is focused on Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley and the creation of the Southern Pacific Command, initially based in Auckland, New Zealand, later on moved up to Noumea. However, I do think that Admiral Nimitz and the Central Pacific, the CINCPAC staff, does deserve a portion of the blame here, and let's talk about why. So on July 5th, Sink pack, Admiral Nimitz sends a note out that the carriers, the CVs, will close in and provide fighter coverage for the APs, the transports. Admiral Fletcher, who's going to command Task Force 61, which is a composite force made up of 3 carrier strike groups built around Saratoga, Enterprise, and the newly arrived Wasp, along with the Southwest Pacific Naval Forces, Task Force 44. These are Australian and American cruisers. And then an amphibious force under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, carrying the 1st Marine Division, are going to land at Guadalcanal. But Fletcher understands with his 3 carriers, he has a finite amount of time that you can deploy your forces before you have to pull out. Admiral Fletcher has learned this lesson the hard way. The initial attempt to reinforce Wake, the raid on Ley, the battle at Coral Sea, the battle at Midway. He knows that carriers have a finite period of time in which they can wage combat before they need to withdraw, replenish, and reinforce and replace losses. July 7th, Nimitz sends word that the arrangements for logistics for the forthcoming campaign in the South Pacific are underway. There will be no difficulty in keeping 4 carrier task forces supplied with fuel. That's going to bite Nimitz in the ass. Back in April of 42 into May of 42, there was a plan to send not just the Yorktown and Lexington in the Coral Sea, but to reinforce them with Halsey's Enterprise and Hornet coming back from the Doolittle raid. And they did a very extensive study on the logistics, and they believe that they could have maintained those forces in the Coral Sea for up to a month. What they didn't factor in is an amphibious force, and more importantly, they also didn't deal with the issue of a split command arrangement, which is what's going to happen with the creation of South Pacific. Admiral Gormley arrives out in the region in May, but he doesn't stand up South Pacific Command until June. And even then, he doesn't have a lot of time to get his feet familiar with the land and the plan that's being thrust upon him by Admiral King, the head of the U.S. Navy, and Admiral Nimitz. July 8th, Admiral Gormley sends Task 1 requires the presence of troop ships and supply ships and supporting ships in the Tulagi area from 36 hours to 4 days. So one of the crucial elements not talked about enough here is the fact that these troop ships, these APs and AKs, these are the troop ships and the cargo ships. Later on, there'll be APAs and AKAs, but they're not redesignated yet as such, do not have the ability to offload very quickly. Literally every piece of cargo that's loaded on these ships is individual boxes, either cardboard boxes or wooden boxes. Cardboard boxes are great because they're light, but they fall apart in the humidity and the rain. Wooden boxes are great, but they're heavy. Most importantly, there's no efficient method to get that equipment off the ships, onto the shore, and more importantly, off the beach and inland. That is going to be your stopping gap. And then on July 9th, Nimitz sends, it's expected about 225,000 barrels per fuel oil per CV task force per month will be available. So he's going to get roughly 4 times that amount if all 4 task forces are down there. But what we're going to find out is that is not going to be sufficient. So this chart puts together kind of very roughly the deployment of forces. So coming down from Pearl Harbor is Task Force 11 built around the Saratoga. It is bringing down the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion and a few small units, including the Marine Raiders, coming down. Coming out of Australia will be the 1st and 5th Marines. 2 regiments are the Corps of General Vandergrift's 1st Marine Division. Saratoga is going to be followed by Task Force 16, the Enterprise, which in turn will be followed by another oiler. Platt and Cimarron are coming down with Saratoga, and then coming from the West Coast is going to be Task Force 18. This is the Wasp, bringing out the 2nd Marine Regiment. Now, by July 26th, the ships arrive off Fiji, and Fiji is where they're going to do the test of the landing. It's going to be a staged landing at Coro. Saratoga is going to be there. Saratoga is the flagship for Admiral Fletcher. They are going to rendezvous with the troop ships coming out of New Zealand, and they're going to practice the landing. In the meantime, Plott which is emptied of fuel. It's actually going to transfer what fuel it has left over to Cimarron. They will rendezvous with one of the smaller oilers. Plot and Cimarron are two fast oilers. They're going to rendezvous with Kanawha, and they will provide the refueling for Task Force 11, the Saratoga, for the Enterprise, and for the amphibious vessels, along with the strike group. Platt runs to Noumea to meet up with two commercial tankers to refuel. In the meantime, Kaskaskia sails late from Pearl Harbor in a convoy of replenishment vessels and cargo ships that are heading for the South Pacific. Now, at Coro, they do the amphibious invasion, but the biggest problem to me is they don't test what's called throughput. Seeing how long it takes to offload one LCVP or one Mike boat full of equipment, full of not troops. Troops are easy to move. Troops move themselves. You have their own two legs. They get on, they get off. What doesn't move very fast is boxes. And the question is, how long is it going to take to load up ducks and LCVPs and all these landing craft and then land them on the beach? And how long is it going to take you to offload them through a surf and, more importantly, get that goods off the beach inland? That is not tested. What we don't have are stevedores and pioneers that can be used to facilitate this offloading, because what's going to take the longest part to offload isn't the troops, it's the cargo. So July 29th, you have this going on. Now, a lot of criticism here for Vice Admiral Gormley not being at Coro to watch this. He sends his Chief of Staff, Admiral Dan Callahan, to do it. Gormley, in the meantime, has just moved up, literally during this period of time, just moved up from Auckland to Noumea on board USS Argonne. Argonne is his flagship. He has not had the time to set up a shore base in which to command. So he's got to use a mobile base, and he uses Argonne for that. And he is trying to set up all the processes in place, coordinating not just with South Pacific, but also with General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific on this operation. So I have some sympathy for Gormley in this. I think he is thrown in the deep end quite a bit here, and he's not allowed the times to set up, in particularly his logistics and his staff. In the meantime, after the exercise, Cimarron and Platt are drained. Kanawha has some residual fuel left, and the task force that's going to head to Guadalcanal has not had the time to replenish fully. That's going to be a problem, because Fletcher, with his three carrier strike groups and his amphibious group and support ships, are going to arrive at Guadalcanal not fully fueled. On July 28th, Fletcher sends this out to Gormley. Irrespective of value exercise of Phase 1, referring to what happened around Coro, this force will be short estimated more than 50,000 barrels of fuel. That is about a third of the size of Plot or Cimarron, the entire capability of Kanawha, after emptying Plot and Cimarron on 31 July. So Fletcher is sending out notice like, hey, I'm going to be short on fuel. I've done this operation before. I have done battles at Coral Sea. I've done Midway. I am very familiar with what we need should the Japanese come out and encounter us. And remember, he doesn't think the Japanese are going to come out immediately after the invasion of Guadalcanal. What he's worried about is that the Imperial fleet is going to put together a force at Truk and eventually come down, which it does later in August, which is the Battle of Eastern Solomon. So on August 1st, as they complete the operation at Coro, the situation is he's got Kaskaskia fully fueled. Plot and Cimarron are empty. Cimarron has run over to New Caledonia to go refuel from commercial tankers. And one of the big issues here is there's supposed to be about 2 commercial tankers down every week sending arrival. But one of the problems is the coordination between Gormley and Nimitz's staff in where to send these commercial tankers. August 1st, Gormley sends out urgently need additional fuel at New Caledonia. He has Cimarron there. It is empty. There's not enough fuel to reload it. Platt's going to be there very shortly. Nimitz sends out, he's dispatching 2 big fast chartered tankers now available in San Pedro, that's Los Angeles, to Noumea. That is 2 weeks away. It's going to be mid-August before those ships can arrive. Following day, there is evidence of fuel trouble in the South Pacific. The trouble seems in distribution rather than lack of fuel. Remember, Nimitz had said that they were going to handle the fuel, but now the problem is the distribution, the coordination down in the Southern Pacific area. And then Fletcher sends out on 3 August, recommend tankers now in Suva, that is Fiji, be sent to Afate or Noumea immediately. If no tankers Afate for Task Force 62, 62 is the transport force along with the guarding cruisers and destroyers, top-off situation may be serious. And what we see here is by 4 August, the tankers are eventually refueled. 2 commercial tankers come into Fiji, and so they're going to be able to top off Kaskaskia and Plot and Kanawha. Cimarron does top off, but one of the tankers waiting in Noumea, the RFA Bishopdale, will strike a mine on the way out of Noumea. Cimarron will rendezvous with Task Force 61, and they will provide fuel, but nowhere near enough fuel. CTF-16, this is the Enterprise Task Force led by Fletcher, will send this. Destroyers of this task force completed fueling from Cimarron. Fueling summary for this force as of this date indicates heavy ships have fuel for 3 days at 15 knots plus 4 days at 25 knots. 25 knots is the speed you'll be doing flight operations in. Destroyers have fuel for 3 days at 15 knots plus 2 days at 25 knots. This is for August. So you've got basically about 5 days worth of fuel on the destroyers if you slow steam for 3 of those. This is August 4th. That takes you to August 9th. This is a substantial problem, and Fletcher is going into battle at Guadalcanal without being topped off. Remember, when he did the strike against Ley, they topped off on the run in, and then they came out and met the Oilers to top off on the way out. August 6th, the day before the invasion, the amphibious force is going to go into Guadalcanal. The strike group, the carriers, Task Force 61, will operate south of Guadalcanal. Cimarron at this point has been drained. Kaskaskia and Platte have sailed from Fiji, but they're way behind the task force. The best Fletcher can hope for is to meet the 3 Oilers, Cimarron, Kaskaskia, and Platte, after the landing is taking place. You have the Japanese will launch a counterattack against the landing. Initially, airstrikes, which are geared to go against the Americans in New Guinea, are diverted. They are sent against the strike group that is located off Guadalcanal. Admiral Makawa is going to put together a cruiser task force, sail down and attack the Americans at Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Ironically, when Admiral Fletcher attacked Tulagi on the ramp up to the Battle of Coral Sea, one of his plans was to send his cruisers in behind his airstrike on this region, but he didn't do it for fear that the cruisers may have fallen under enemy air attack. The Japanese are going to take advantage of this. So on August 8th, Cimarron, which had been emptied, is heading back to Fiji. Again, those commercial tankers aren't being sent forward to Noumea, they're being sent to Fiji. This is the mistake that Gormley's staff makes. Meanwhile, Kaskaskia and Platte are sitting there at Noumea waiting for the strike group to come out. Task Force 16 sends out word, continuing support air operations this afternoon. Fuel situation in this force is becoming critical. It is estimated the destroyers have fuel for about 3 days at 15 knots, and the heavy ships have little more. August 8th, Fletcher sends word, request you send tankers immediately to rendezvous decided by you as fuel running low. Now, this puts the onus on Gormley to determine where to send his Oilers. He can send Kaskaskia and Platte up to the carrier strike group, keep them off Guadalcanal, but it puts those Oilers under potential air attack from the Japanese. Plus, there are submarines in the area that Fletcher is worried about. Does he want to risk this? Instead, what Gormley decides to do is send Kaskaskia and Platte just north of New Caledonia, south of Espiritu Santo, and tell Fletcher head south and rendezvous. Then you get the Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th and 9th. The Japanese are able to inflict a grievous defeat on the Americans and the Australians. 3 American heavy cruisers, 1 Australian heavy cruiser are lost. Multiple ships are damaged. The saving grace for the Americans is that Admiral Makawa doesn't follow up his attack with an attack on the troop ships off Guadalcanal and off Tulagi. However, at the end of the battle, while two of the cruisers sink almost immediately, the Quincy and the Vincennes, Canberra and Astoria are still afloat come the morning. And there is hope to potentially save those two vessels. But because the forces are withdrawing and there is no repair or salvage equipment sent up forward with this fleet, there's really no recourse but to scuttle these two ships. And Astoria and Canberra are going to go down in Iron Bottom Sound. And when you look at the American and Australian forces that were dispatched in the Pacific in August of 1942, you can get a real quick idea of how successful the Americans become at repair. Task Force 8 is sent up into the Aleutians, but some of those ships are eventually going to come down off Guadalcanal. The composition of the three carrier strike groups later reinforced by the WASP group, Task Force 18, and then other reinforcements that come in. Lagi is set up as an interim repair base. It'll be used for USS Portland after the brawl on November 13th. It'll also be used for USS Minneapolis and New Orleans following the Battle of Tassafaronga. The idea of having repair capabilities up front and forward become very key, so that when you look at the task force, all the ships in blue there are damaged during the campaign, and they're all going to head off for repair facilities. The key is having some repair facilities forward located so that you can do the patch up. So for example, Minneapolis and New Orleans, Minneapolis is going to go to Mare Island. New Orleans goes to Sydney, where the closest dry dock is, but eventually it will also go over to Mare Island. Saratoga and Enterprise, the two carriers, are both going to go up to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The North Carolina goes up to Pearl Harbor. South Dakota will go to Pearl Harbor after it grounds, but then eventually over to New York. And then other ships will go. And even the ships that are sunk, those identified in red, will be replaced by new vessels coming off the slipways. At the end of the Battle of Savo Island, the troop ships are going to withdraw. This is that abandonment that the Marines always talk about. But the key thing is most of the supplies are not offloaded because, again, what we saw was congestion on the beaches and inadequate planning on how to throughput the cargo. In the meantime, Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp sail south. They rendezvous with Kaskaskia and Platte. They are going to refuel and be able to then come back into position south of Guadalcanal. And that will provide the elements necessary to bring carriers back south of Guadalcanal. The realization is that it's probably not the best idea to empty all three carrier task force at the same time. Instead, what's going to happen is that Admiral Fletcher will keep two of the three carrier strike groups forward and one will head south, replenishing until he can get clear intelligence that the Japanese are going to make a move. He does not get that clear intelligence. It's the reason why Wasp is south, refueling when the Battle of Eastern Solomons is fought. The other element here is the buildup on Guadalcanal itself. The U.S. Navy will take into service the fast destroyer transports to run food and fuel up to Guadalcanal until they can organize convoys that can make the run to Guadalcanal, the larger troop ships and cargo ships going up. But the other element is with the seizure of the airfield in Guadalcanal, subsequently Henderson Field, there needs to be the arrival of reinforcements. And this is done by USS Long Island, the first escort carrier in the U.S. Long Island, which had been off the west coast of the United States conducting flight training for new carrier pilots, also had been doing escort duty for Task Force 1, the 7 older battleships, the 3 survivors from Pearl Harbor, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee, with the 3 New Mexicos plus Colorado, which had been in the West Coast undergoing refit. Long Island is loaded up with 2 Marine squadrons, Fighter Squadron VMF 223 and Bombing Squadron VMSB 232, and will fly off those 2 squadrons to Henderson Field. Coming behind Long Island is USS Kitty Hawk, the same ship that had brought Wildcats and Dauntlesses to Midway. She is loaded with 2 more squadrons, VMF 224 and VMSB 231. The problem is she can't go into Guadalcanal and offload those planes directly. So the U.S. comes up with an innovative way. I got to say, just an amazing process for how to get those 2 follow-up squadrons to Henderson Field. Normally, what you would have is the ship would come into port and offload. So Kitty Hawk comes into Afate in the New Hebrides, and the plan was to offload the fighters and dive bombers onto barges. They were going to barge them ashore. Then they would have to drag them through the streets to the airfield. Now, that's going to take days for that to be accomplished, and unfortunately, the Marines don't have days. So instead, Kitty Hawk and Long Island come up with a novel idea. The image on the left here is Kitty Hawk alongside Long Island. There's a barge that's put between them to create some distance between the two. And what Kitty Hawk is doing is craning off Wildcats, in this case, fighters, onto the deck of Long Island. There's a small minesweeper that is there. It's not pictured in the image here. That minesweeper is turning Long Island into the wind and then using Long Island's catapult. They are launching the planes as they come on board. The Wildcats are fitted with drop tanks. There's a small little round object underneath the Wildcat. That is the drop tank. Within a day, they're going to get all the Wildcats, actually 2 days, Wildcats and Dauntlesses on Long Island catapulted off. They fly them up to Espiritu Santo, and then with the drop tanks, they can fly directly to Guadalcanal. That allows the rapid reinforcement of Guadalcanal by the end of the month with an additional fighter squadron and dive bombing squadron. Later on in September, USS Kapahi, one of the other new light escort carriers, comes out. She does the same exact thing. She will fly off a fighter and dive bombing squadron, and USS Hammondsport, sister ship to Kitty Hawk, will do the same thing with Kapahi and fly off its 2 squadrons. Now, the Battle of Eastern Solomons in late August of 1942 results in damage to USS Enterprise. 3 bomb hits will happen on board Enterprise, and one of the things that we see is how quickly repairs can be effected. The ship is brought over to Tonga for quick repairs, but what becomes very clear is that it's going to have to go up to Pearl Harbor. But the other element of the Battle of Eastern Solomons that's really important, and again, it's a criticism of Admiral Fletcher, is Fletcher reports early after the Guadalcanal invasion that his fighter strength is down from 99 fighters down to 78 fighters. And if you look at the air groups on board the American carriers at the time of Battle of Eastern Solomons, those loss of fighters are represented in those air groups. In other words, for the first weeks in August of 1942, there are no replacement aircraft coming out to Fletcher. Remember, when Fletcher had Yorktown out in the Southern Pacific in March and April of 1942, he was able to replenish his aircraft by stealing them off Lexington. At Midway, he replenishes Enterprise and Hornet from Saratoga. He does not have that capability in the South Pacific. In other words, the air groups that are on the 3 carriers is all he has. There are no replacements coming out. The reinforcement of the Marine squadrons onto Henderson Field is taking up any capability that Long Island and Kapahi have to deliver replacement aircraft. So when Enterprise is damaged as a result of the Battle of Eastern Solomons, one of the things it does is it sheds part of its air group to get the air groups on board Saratoga and Wasp up to speed. Now, Hornet's coming down, but Hornet won't arrive until after this. And then subsequently, Wasp is going to be lost from a submarine attack. Half of its air group goes down with it. Saratoga is going to be damaged by a submarine. It's going to be able to fly off part of its air group. But the Americans do not have an efficient system in place to keep their carrier air groups alive. Fletcher had learned this the hard way from the operations in the South Pacific and at the Battle of Midway. But Nimitz does not seem to have put into place a mechanism whereby the carrier strike groups can be replenished. And that's going to be a big issue throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. All right, so what are the big takeaways from early U.S. Navy logistics in the Pacific, 1941 to 42? Well, we looked at 4 things. Number 1, replenishment. One of the key things was to take the Navy oilers and devote them to supporting the carrier strike groups and surface groups. which meant you needed tankers. You needed commercial tankers. And starting in January through March of 1942, Admiral King, as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Fleet, along with his dual role, subsequently as Chief of Naval Operations, will get commercial tankers to come in and expand that footprint so that commercial tankers can replace that. That's one of the reasons I would argue that even if the Japanese had knocked out part of the fuel farm at Pearl Harbor, the allocation of 21 tankers in January, with more coming in February and March, the U.S. could basically afloat the oil necessary to replace those damaged tanks. Plus, it was building the new Red Hill facility. It expands the fleet oiler role. Again, the 6 fleet oilers become really crucial, and the loss of Neosho in May of 42 at Coral Sea highlights this. And probably the most important is there needs to be improved planning and coordination. It's one thing to have the fuel there. It's a whole other thing to be able to ensure that that fuel is being properly delivered. And most importantly, that ships are arriving into potential combat as fueled as possible. In the area of repair, there's only a few repair facilities located in the Pacific for the U.S. and the Australians. Pearl Harbor is the major repair base. Sydney has a dry dock, can't handle an aircraft carrier, and then of course there's the West Coast with Mare Island, Long Beach, and most importantly Puget Sound, which is the significant one there. But you also need salvage and towing. Again, the role of Vero down at Midway is essential. We'll see at Battle of Santa Cruz, for example, Hornet is going to require Northampton, a heavy cruiser, to tow her out. Later on, we'll see salvage tugs and firefighting capability integrated into Carrier Task Force. And then having forward repair as far forward as possible in Tulagi, over at Espiritu Santos, at Tonga. That's really important, because what you don't want to do is lose ships that can be at least pulled out of combat and subsequently repaired and brought back into the fight. In terms of reinforcements, that big fight between Europe and Pacific is best characterized by the deployment of the divisions. We see the emphasis on reinforcing both Hawaii and the Australia supply line, and then that offensive buildup that goes into not just Guadalcanal, but also New Guinea by both the U.S. and Australian forces being based in Australia. And then finally, replacements. How do you maintain those forces? The crucial role that the escort auxiliary carriers are going to play to be able to keep the frontline carriers up and running, and a ability to rotate forces in and out of the area becomes really important, because you're going to wear through and burn through your forces. If you look at those carrier air groups, they get really churned up quite a bit. You need replacements for them. The U.S. gets by with really kind of sandwiching together some of those air groups, but in the long run, it doesn't work. And we really see it probably the best with the Marine Corps and Army squadrons based in Guadalcanal and New Guinea, how they cannot maintain themselves. And I think what you learn from early U.S. logistics in the Pacific in 1941-42 is this is the training ground, so that by 43 and 44, you can project forces over longer distances, sustain them over longer distances, and then when those two drives come together in the Philippines, you can do that final drive to cut Japan off and be prepared, should it be necessary, which it isn't, for the invasion of Japan. I think this also has huge lessons learned for today. Tyranny of distance is the same. Technology has changed. The opponents have potentially changed going into 2026. But what hasn't changed is the tyranny of distance. Pacific is as big as it was 80-something years ago. And a lot of the issues with refueling, replenishment, reinforcements, repair, and replacement still echoes across. I hope you enjoyed this historic episode of What Went On with Shipping. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Want to thank everybody, wish everybody a happy New Year's. We're running into the Happy New Year. This is my very, very lame attempt to emulate what is my favorite podcast for the year. I got my little thing from YouTube saying, what did you watch, Sal, over the year? The YouTube channel I watched the most over the year, it's not What's Going On with Shipping. It's not. It was the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. Seth and John and Bill Tody over there. Just, I love those guys. They do such a great job. I am convinced now, they've been doing it for 5 years. What does it take to make that not the unauthorized history of the Pacific War, but the authorized history of the Pacific War? I mean, what's it going to take? I mean, those guys are authorized, in my opinion. Until our next episode, this is Sal. Sign off.